Anyway, today I've chosen to talk about de Havilland. Why de Havilland? Well, he was a remarkable man. He had a remarkable family. He built an empire on which the sun never ever set. He went through some tragedy. And selfishly, I've also done it because I joined them in the mid-50s and spent 10 years with them. And I'm still a member of what's called the de Havilland Aeronautical Technical School Association. Sounds a big mouthful, but it's a bundle of fun. Since I'm going to talk a little bit about the lead into aeroplanes, you might well say, well, what the hell has that got to do with it? Well, they've all got their connection with de Havilland. And I'm going to leave it there, and you can puzzle over it while I'm talking. And if you come up with the answer, they've all got something absolutely in common. Where do we start? Well, we start on the 27th of July, 1882. When the Reverend Charles de Havilland met his second son. He was quite a busy lad. He had 5 children in the end, 3 sons, Ivan, Geoffrey and Hereward, and 2 daughters, Ione and Gladys. He was a rector. He moved around. It looked like the rector's life actually was not bad. They had some good places to stay, and they stayed in some nice towns. The expectation was that Geoffrey would go into the ministry, not Geoffrey. He and his brother, Ivan, were very close. They loved mechanics, and it's said that before he left home at 17, he and his brother had designed and built steam engines, generating sets, and even motorcycles. So he's quite clever. And he decided, I'm not going to university, let's do it the better way. And I think it's right. He got education and he combined that with an apprenticeship. And that from there he went into what was the new thing of those days, which was, of course, motor vehicles. So he got into the bus business. His big brother Ivan was a real buff at this sort of thing. He joined the RS Motor Company, designed their cars, and he was Geoffrey's guide, mentor and friend. But in 2005, Ivan dropped dead. Don't know why, but he dropped dead. And obviously that was a real blow to Geoffrey. But you can't carry on, so he did. Now we're in the early years of the 20th century, and the 2 boys that are really making the news are Wilbur and Orville Wright. And they came to the UK and Europe in 1908. In the meanwhile, Geoffrey had met up with someone very like Ivan and became his guide, mentor and friend again for the rest of their working life. This is a bloke called Frank Hurl. Frank was particularly into motors, and that played a part in what happened eventually. The first thing that Geoffrey did was to design and build his own engine. He built, he had built it by Iris, a 45 horse, 4-cylinder, water-cooled engine. Light, worked well. Next, he got the money to build. What did he get? He got £1,000 from his grandfather. And to put a bit of context in that, that's worth about $250,000 these days. But he borrowed $250,000 and went into business. Built his first aeroplane with Frank Hurl. Frank, as I say, was with him for the rest of their life. And in fact, it got so close that Frank married Ione and Geoffrey also married Louis. This sort of started the business that grew so large. So what do you get? You get Geoffrey as a young man. I've also put in a photo of Hereward. Hereward was also a remarkably clever, resourceful man. In fact, Hereward was the man behind setting the empire up around the world. He opened businesses for Geoffrey for many years. Geoffrey designed and built his first aeroplane. Something went wrong. It wasn't strong enough. So when they finally got it off the ground, it immediately came back again, and he was ended up with just the engine and 1 propeller. He picked himself up, he just got a thump on the wrist, used the propeller, used the engine, and he started with biplane number 2. Now you see there also the sort of rectory in which they stayed. So I'd say life looked to be very comfortable for that family. Having done that, he had to find a job. It so happened that the British Army in the form of the War Office was getting a bit worried about the way wars were going. There were all these foreigners. They first came up with balloons, and as you know, balloons pop up and they can see what you're up to. And then dang me, they also had aeroplanes, and aeroplanes were even worse. I mean, you couldn't have a good war without a cavalry, and without cavalry being sort of frightened by the aeroplanes, you're in real trouble. So they set up their own business at Farnborough, which in fact for the next nearly 100 years was the centrepiece of British research and development. And he sold them to them as chief designer and also chief test pilot. And they said, right, well, okay, now let's see what you can do. So these are some of the early planes that he worked. The FE2, the VE2, the SE2. Although the War Office was a bit worried about our traditional enemies like the French and the Germans, they called the FE2 a Farman experimental because it had an engine at the back. And the VE2 was a Blériot experimental because it had an engine at the front. Geoffrey spent time doing this. He also joined the Royal Flying Corps. He was a second lieutenant, and he spent about 2 years working at the factory. He had a crash because he was the chief test pilot, but the crash came about because he was trying to get out of a spin that aeroplane that couldn't get out of a spin. So he got rather bent in that, but he survived. He had his second son was born then. The first one he'd actually taken up in his first successful aeroplane. Again, it's pretty amazing because these guys are not only trying their new aeroplane, they're also learning to fly at the same time. So he's very confident what he was doing. Of course, now we have war coming. So you get called up. Geoffrey was called up. They sent him to the east coast of Scotland, gave him a Blériot and said, well, go and find us some submarines. And you think on that, a Blériot was a pretty dodgy bit of aeroplane. It was weak. It had a rather poor engine. The weather at the east coast of Scotland wasn't too hot. And submarines had a dirty great gun on the front, so you really didn't want to find him. But in fact, he thought, yeah, it's not too good. So they, in fact, brought him back, and he got himself a job with Airco, the aircraft manufacturing company, and he started designing for them. And that's where he put together his practical knowledge and experience as a pilot and designer. So he also started to number the designs, starting with DH, and he was an entrepreneur. So he persuaded them that these aeroplanes they were going to build, you were going to need quite a few, since you got a war on. He got a royalty on every one. So his first real one was the DH-2 fighter. Now these were the days in the early parts of the war, as you realise, when things just hadn't developed. So you give a bloke, a young lad, an aeroplane, say go and do something useful. Well, he borrows grandfather's blunderbuss or father's shotgun, and off he goes. But a better way is to put a machine gun on the front and point the aeroplane at the other aeroplane, and you stand a better chance of knocking him down. But the catch was, of course, there was a propeller in the way. So until you got the days where people like Konstantin Esko and Tony Fokker actually designed interrupter gears, the first lads to do it, of course, quickly found themselves with toothless blades. There was nothing left. You just shot them off. So the obvious answer is get the engine out the way. So the first fighter he designed had an engine at the back, and it was a real success. You're in the middle of what was called the Fokker Scourge, where Tony Fokker, who was of course Dutch, had been designing aeroplanes for the Germans, and their planes were knocking the British down like nobody's business. Well, this was the first successful one to actually overcome that problem. His next one was the DH-4 bomber. They needed a bomber. He came up with what was arguably the best bomber in the war, because it was aerodynamically good. It had a terrific engine in the Rolls-Royce Eagle. it also was well designed in terms of being able to be flown. So it didn't get into trouble like a lot of the bombers because it could climb higher and faster than the aeroplanes that were trying to shoot it down. There was a catch. The pilot and the observer were quite a distance apart, so it was a bit difficult to talk to each other, and sitting between them, in fact, was a dirty great petrol tank, which was also a bit of an embarrassment at times. But it was good. The other problem, of course, Scott, if you goes to a fighter, is that if you've got a biplane fighter, it's really very difficult to see the hull in the sun, the guy up above you. So Jeffrey's answer to that was a backward stagger. So if you move the top wing backwards, in fact the pilot is sitting out in really clear air and he gets a far better view of things. For some reason that didn't actually catch on very well, but it was a good fighter. He designed various aeroplanes, but the next one was the 9, which was supposed to be the bee's knees. That was a cleaned up DH4. It was easy to make, but a lousy engine, because Rolls were making so many engines that there weren't any to spare, so they palmed them off with what's called the Armstrong-Siddeley Puma, which was a 6-cylinder engine, but it was so unreliable it was detuned, and so they lost an awful lot of them. The saving grace was the Americans now had just entered the war, and like everybody else, they didn't have any aeroplanes available really to fight the Germans or anybody else, and they picked the DH9, but they were very canny. They didn't like the engine, and therefore we got to the famous situation where they got their 2 top designers, locked them in a hotel room, and said you don't come out till you've got a design of an engine. And 5 days later they emerged with the design of the Liberty engine, and that was in May 1917. In July the first engine was delivered for test. In the next 16 months they built nearly 14,000 of them. And just an idea of sort of what the engines looked like in those days. The Eagle was a really good, reliable, powerful engine. They had, without a blink of shame, pinched the valve gear off the Mercedes-Benz pre-war GP car. Seemed a good idea, so the Liberty boys did the same. But the Liberty was really clever because it was built in modules, so you can build a 4, a 6, an 8, or a 12-cylinder engine from basically the same parts, which is what they did. And they brought in the boys who knew how to make things, Studebaker and Ford and similar car companies. And as I say, they turned out an awful lot. All told, they made nearly 20,000. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because after the war, Jeffrey needed an airfield. And I guess you will all have heard of Stag Lane. Well, this is sort of the home of de Havilland. In 1920, it was in the middle of fields. It's about 10 miles from the centre of London. You drive up to Watling Street, the Roman Road, turn left, and there you are in Stag Lane. He came upon the London Provincial Flying Club, settled in, and bought the place in about 22, and it all expanded from there. So this is the factory, and at that time they were also building engines. And they ran out of room in the early 30s, so they went to Hatfield and started building there, and built a really big plant there. And this unit actually sits at the back of the Hatfield plant. This is where a lot of the work went on engines, propellers, and test cells, including a Blue Streak guided missile. So they were very versatile. So Jeffrey started to design his own aeroplanes. Now in those days, there were thousands and thousands of aeroplanes and engines left over from the war, so there wasn't much of a market. So when you did design something, you might sell 3, 6, a dozen. And of course, as you know, to start with, after the war, like West Australian Airways, you take an old fighter or a bomber, you put a little covering on it, and you call it an airline. So here in this country, we used a a DH9. Remember that really used Bristol fighters exactly the same. So really they were looking for something that was better designed. So over a period of years, they got bigger, but they weren't all that flash in the end, but they weren't. The thing that really got de Havilland off the ground though was he recognised the need for small aeroplanes, such as this aero club here. After the war you had a lot of people who could fly, a lot of people who realised that flying was a great way to get around. You might have some of the gentry who thought an aeroplane sitting on the front lawn of their castle would look really good, or you might want to nick over to Paris for a meal at Café de Paris or whatever. And so he designed the Moth. And the Moth really made de Havilland. He had a problem there. The problem was the engine. There was nothing really made that was up to it. But this is where we come to a bloke called Frank Halford. Frank Halford, Major Frank Halford, was an engine designer. He did his own little company and he went into partnership with Sir Harry Ricardo, who was a very famous combustion expert at that time, and in fact for many years afterwards. And Air Disco, which was one of the companies that was set up after the war to get rid of all the stuff, said, well, we've got all these engines, we've got this thing like was a Renault engine. It's not a French Renault engine, it's a British Renault engine, made about 60, 90, 100 horsepower, thousands of them, all right, but not very good. What are we going to do with them? And so Frank designed an engine that used a lot of bits of that engine, and it became the Cirrus. Not the Havilland engine, but the Cirrus, made by Air Disco. And that's what got the Moth off the ground. But it had some drawbacks. It was actually a bit of a compromise. Frank Hurl knew Halford very well because they used to go motoring together and in competition. And so he got him to design a more practical engine, which was the Gypsy. And that's where the Gypsy first came into the mix. And that really made the grade because it was not only with power, but it was also reliable. And that's in the days when you get like Amy Johnson or Bert Hinkler or Gene Batten picking them off and just happening to fly across the world. And in fact, the way they tried to sell it was, well, every home should have one. So over here, this apparently is what they did. Land, fold the wings, hop it onto your car and drive home. Australia is one of the countries that arrive at this time. That's a photograph of Hereward here in 1929. As you see, he turned up 1927, screwed his aeroplane together, drove off to Melbourne, set up his company, and away we went. Then he moved on to New Zealand, South Africa, South America and Canada. And in 1929 we had our centenary, so he entered that and he won it. He did a lot of work, that man, and he contributed a lot towards development of de Havilland. And of course, being a manufacturer in those days, you got into the real oddball stuff. The government had funny ideas too. They wanted an aeroplane built, but they wanted an aeroplane built with a 750cc motorcycle engine, so everybody obliged. And the Hummingbird was de Havilland's effort, and they made a few. It did well, they sold them, but it really wasn't very practical. But now we come to the first Tiger Moth. Tiger Moth probably never heard of. At that time, they had started to produce the Gypsy engine, and then they started to develop it, and they wanted to see what they could do with it. So they were made a couple of these, and they did rather well. It wasn't easy to fly, but it still made about 180 miles an hour on a 100 horsepower engine. So for the late 20s, it was a pretty good effort. This one was a failure. And the main reason for the failure was Geoffrey did the design of the engine. He took a couple of Gypsy major blocks and made a V8. It didn't work. This one we'll come back to, but we all know what that one was. Made the difference to de Havilland in the way they actually approached building aeroplanes. 1928, various things happened, but I've sort of put a number of the engines up. That's Geoffrey's original. In fact, it vanished, and as apprentices, we had to recreate it. The Gypsy, in its original form, and the Gypsy Major, and then as time went on, as you always do, you want a bit more power. Talk to Frank, okay, we'll whack on a couple more cylinders, and that suddenly you've got 200 horsepower. And jumping ahead a bit again, when Geoffrey needed a lot more power, the Gypsy 12, I don't know of any other air-cooled V12 engine. If you want to see one, go to the Science Museum in London. There's one there. But one of the significant changes was the inversion of the engine. Everybody seemed to make them that way at that time. Obvious disadvantages. You've got all these dangly bits waving in the wind. They didn't cool very well. Turning it upside down, not only was your cooling better, your view better, but a lot of your planes were used for training. So the further you kept your propeller away from the ground, the better. The cheaper it was to actually operate a flying plane. So this engine was used in about 30 or more different aircraft. So many aircraft. Obviously the one you know very well. Geoffrey, apart from being a mad, keen mothman, I think they call them lepidopterists, also liked to shoot big game, but he liked to shoot big game with a movie camera. So he used to pack himself and the missus into a flying machine, namely a moth or something, and hop off to Africa, do his big game shooting and come back. But of course now, Louis was getting on a bit, she was in the 40s and she really was a bit tired with all the hair blowing in the wind. She said, well, how about you a bit more protection? So he did. So he started with the Puss Moths. That one didn't come to anything. The obvious one, the 82, the Tiger Moth, I put in John Markham's. I couldn't resist John Markham's aeroplane, that beautiful aeroplane, the Hornet Moth and the Leopard Moth. So times were changing. He was going to monoplanes instead of biplanes. They were actually much more civilized. Also, transportation was changing. You needed big aeroplanes, they needed to be simple, they needed to be reliable. He started off with the Dragon, which had Gypsy Majors, needed a lot more capacity and power, so we went to 4 engines in the Express, which also used the 6-cylinder. So suddenly you've gone from about 240 horsepower to 800 horsepower. He upgraded the Dragon to the Dragon Rapide, and then the 90 was sort of the rich man's flying machine. It had all the bells and whistles and did look good on the front lawn of a castle. This is, I think, the nub of the success of the company. Geoffrey took de Havilland's workers very seriously. In the early days it was easy. He was just making a few aeroplanes. There were plenty of people around that could do the job. But the more successful you get, the more people you get. The more people you get, the more experience and skill you need. And so come around in the middle of the 20s, you start to run out of people. You need pilots, you need mechanics, you need technicians, you need engineers. So in 1928, he set up what he called his University of the Air. I say that's the mouthful, de Havilland Aeronautical Technical School. And even has its own little logo, which we all wore with pride. And to make it even more worthwhile, the apprentices were encouraged and helped to design, build and fly their own aeroplanes. There was a series of 5, the TK series. It was called TK, we think, because the one of the designers of the first one was a Dutchman, and technical college in Dutch is Technische Collegia or something of the sort. Anyway, we got the TK series. The TK1 was a fairly simple, easy to fly little beast. The TK2 was a bit more ambitious. The TK3 wasn't really successful. The TK4 was an absolute cracker. But the TK5 never got off the ground. It was a canard. And do what they could never get it off the ground. But he did look after his apprentices. You had a brochure that told you what was expected of you, what you'd get, how much you'd get, where you were going to do it. And I've added the front of the 49 brochure. And this is the apprentices' accommodation, Aswick Manor, on the edge of the airfield. So he took it seriously, and it showed. Here's just a couple of the airplanes he made before the war. One thing I've noted here is, I know this is not the Havilland, but the propeller is a very serious part of the business. And the early Spitfires and Hurricanes had two-blade fixed pitch propellers. You know, like saying to Danny Ricciardo, well, go out and take on the Mercedes and we're giving you an epic car with one gear. He got to be into the bigger things. This is where things change. Didn't make many of them, but the Albatross was absolutely beautiful. It had the 4 Gypsy Kings. It had the most terrific streamlining of the sails. This was his first all-metal plane with non-de Havilland engines for once. Things changed, the way of doing it. He really kicked it off with the Comet. Different ways to build things, retractable undercarriages. The Comet had variable pitch air screws, two, either it was coarse or it was fine. This is how they built a Mosquito. And that's how, I guess they're still building Mosquitoes. With the former, either of wood or of concrete, you end up with a half of a fuselage. Great for actually building, because you can just stand up and put all the gear inside. And this I found was the Hornet, which was the follow-on aircraft. Built in basically the same way. Here we have the ultimate multi-role combat aircraft, the Mosquito. Just about everyone had 420mm cannon, 4.303 machine guns. If you wanted to go hunting submarines, you packed a 57mm cannon, which would fire a very large shell about every 4 seconds. You could bomb with precision. If you go to Oslo, they will show you where the Gestapo headquarters were. One of the airplanes there. They took it out in the middle of town. They took out the Amiens prison. They let the prisoners out. They chased all the shipping. They used 60-pound rocket projectiles. And it was absolutely wonderful as a night fighter. And it carried the same bomb load as a B-17 to Berlin, 100 miles an hour faster with 2 men instead of 10. And when it finished the course, it still had all that armament. So that is the prototype Meteor. That is the prototype Shooting Star, the P-80. The Meteor, of course, was meant for the Rolls-Royce engines, but Rolls-Royce were in deep trouble. The only engines they had were the Havilland engines. The P-80, my old boss took a Goblin across the Atlantic twice in 1943 to go into that aircraft. Twice because the first time the boys weren't used to it and somebody got sucked in the front, so it got damaged. So I had to have another go. And this one I put in because it's a bit oddball. Saab J21. What's particularly strange is
started off with a push of propeller.
Exactly. Before it had a Mercedes-Benz engine, I think. That's right. So I'm going to stop there. So I hope you've enjoyed it.